So, this first industrial society is going to be a little different than what we've seen before. Before, society was pretty much broken into commoners and nobility. Now, the commoners, sometimes as we get closer and closer to this time period, sometimes there are some discrete differences between commoners, like those that have money and those that don't have money. But the big difference during that time period is, do you have a noble title or do you not have a noble title? Now, within this first industrial society, society is going to become more complex. There's going to be more discrete groups within society. And sometimes the difference between a wealthy member of common society and an aristocrat is a very, very fine line, because you're going to see that these social classes are aspirational, that if you were a lower class, you aspire to have some of the things, some of the trappings of your social superior, like the next social group up. You want to kind of mimic them. So again, we've had a massive increase in output that's occurring as industrialization takes hold in Britain. And this is going to mean a multitude of things. One, there's a rapid development of railroad systems. The government really understands that the best way to keep this industrial revolution going is to invest in transportation, is to be able to get goods from point A to point B as quickly as humanly possible. And early on, this is going to be the further development of roads, to where we are moving away from dirt roads and we're starting to get to macadam, which, by the way, is a Scottish invention. Blacktop roads, basically, which will mean that roads are um, usable every single day of the year, 365 days a year, versus with the dirt roads, when you have a rainy season, when you have a lot of snow, the road simply will become impassable. And if we can't use the roads, then we can't trade and we can't produce. We're also going to invest in a canal system, which really is going to be England's first big infrastructure system. And then later on, the canals, excuse me, will be replaced by a railroad system here as well. Also, during this time, we have some significant changes going on. Agriculture is becoming less important by comparison. Like, for example, in 1891, agriculture generated only 8% of British national income. This is a massive shift where, a century earlier, it had been really the backbone of British national income. And in general, this is going to transform vastly daily life. So you want to go ahead and put a little star there by number 4. I mean, for some people, this very rapid and drastic change is going to be very traumatic for some. And in general, different people are going to be affected in different ways. You will see some people who are affected in a very minute way, at least early on, and that changes for them are going to be more long term. And you'll see some people where the changes are very, very traumatic and they occur nearly instantaneously. The first group here is going to be the British aristocracy. These land-owning aristocrats had little material loss in the Industrial Revolution. I mean, they go into the Industrial Revolution very wealthy, and they tend to leave the Industrial Revolution very wealthy. However, power-wise, there is some shifting here, because the aristocracy is declining because urban wealth is becoming more important. The centers of power are starting to switch from these landed estates in the countryside to more urban wealth, like bankers and factory owners and manufacturers, those types of things. And because of this, many businessmen, manufacturers, and bankers are going to be enriched, and the aristocrats are going to start to have declining political clout. More and more, It's less members of the aristocracy that are going to be in government and making decisions for government. And more, it's going to be the businessmen, the manufacturers, and these bankers. These newly created industrial wealth or these industrial wealthy individuals will start to claim more political power. And as a result, the aristocrats are going to slowly but surely lose their political influence, at least within the English House of Commons. I mean, they're still going to have a stranglehold on the House of Lords because only aristocrats can be in the House of Lords. But they're going to find that their influence politically in general is starting to decline, even to the point here that by 1900, businessmen are going to lead the major political parties. What this means, and you want to put a note here down by C, is this means big political changes on the horizon. I mean, we're not going to see these big political changes immediately, but as we get further and further into the 19th and into the 20th century, we're going to start to see a very noticeable political shift go on here as well. Now, these other two groups are going to have more substantial changes and more immediate changes than what the aristocracy has. And pretty much everybody below the aristocracy is going to be the common class. And this really isn't necessarily changed, but there's going to be subgroups within this common class, where if you're towards the top, it's becoming harder and harder to see the difference between the noble class and these members of this upper middle class, that type of group. So the upper class, or sorry, rather, the middle class has had the most obvious gains from industrialization. And the middle class is actually going to be broken into three discrete groups. And the first is going to be the upper middle class. These guys are going to become extremely wealthy and they're also going to buy into the aristocratic life. You want to put down here next to number two that many will imitate the lifestyle of the aristocracy. Many will imitate the lifestyle of the aristocracy. It's this group where it starts to become harder and harder to differentiate between this upper middle class and members of the aristocracy. Because what the members of the upper middle class often do will be to buy things that they consider to be aristocrat. You'll start to see them buy up estates, especially when aristocratic families die out. You'll see them have large homes. You'll see them have, stately mansions and servants, and basically they will mimic the aristocrats down to even attempting to, get some type of title. So it becomes even more difficult to differentiate between the two groups. And then the next group is the middle class, which is a large number of smaller businessmen and professionals. These guys tend to be politically liberal, and we'll get into that a little bit later on. And in general, um, they're also going to be aspirational as well, but it's going to be this group that really define the society and culture of this area. Of this era, especially in their ideology of standing for thrift, hard work, rigid morals, and cleanliness. I mean, if any group is going to define this time period, it's going to be this group right in the middle of the middle class. You also are going to start to see women popping up here as well, where middle class women are more frequently cast as homemakers, wives, and mothers. You want to put down here for D underneath number three that they are seen as the moral centers of society and the managers of consumption. So these middle class women, their husbands make enough money so these women do not have to work. In fact, that's going to be a huge goal for members of the lower classes, is for them to be able to make enough money so then the wives are able to stay home and do more of the domestic tasks. Um, what you also will start to see here is as wealth of these families starts to increase, they will have more and more disposable income. And the women of these families are going to be responsible for the partitioning out of that money into what ultimately are going to be luxury goods, ultimately are going to be, in general, just sort of kind of consumer goods. So you'll see this entire industry pop up in advertising of trying to advertise specifically to these female domestic consumers. Below then, of course, the middle class are going to be the lower class. These guys are pretty much in the service sector. They're clerks, secretaries. Um, you will have something unique going on here, that there's employment opportunities for women as well as for men. You will see that this group will include teachers, they'll include secretaries, so women are going to be able to join what we'll later refer to as pink collar jobs. Below this group are going to be then the laboring classes. In the 19th century, 70% of Britons are going to be workers. They're going to be laborers. This also often, more often than not, is referred to as the working class. And these are going to be the ones that really struggle with its industrialization, that they will suffer the most and benefit the least from this new industrialization. Um, Part of this is because of the living conditions. All of this is going to mean rapid urbanization, where by 1851, the majority of Britain's population is going to be urban. And because we have such this flood of individuals into very specific parts of cities, the living conditions are going to be absolutely abominable. We're going to be dealing with vast overcrowding, inadequate sanitation and water supplies, although by mid century, this will start to get a little bit better. We'll have epidemics, again, largely linked to the pun intended craptastic sanitation and water supplies. Like there'll be typhoid, there'll be cholera, you name it. We sort of kind of have it going on at this point. There's few public services or open spaces. There are no public safety nets. I mean, we will start to get some by the end of the 1800s, beginning of the 1900s, and we'll especially see more after World War One. But if you hit hard times and you're a member of the working class, there's nothing there to save you. Although, like I said, the situation will get better. And because of these living conditions, there's going to be parts of cities, in particular London, for example, that will clearly be working class areas, where the working class are going to live, they're going to work, they're going to have what little leisure time they have, kind of taking place in those areas. And because they tend to be segregated, and then the wealthy are segregated into their own areas, there's very little contact between the rich and poor, which will cause problems later on, because the wealthy who are in charge of the government and making governmental decisions will be kind of at a loss as to what the living and working conditions of the working class, or this laboring class are. Now, part of these problems here, and you want to put this just somewhere underneath this list or next to this list underneath number four, that part of this is because these working class areas of the cities grow so quickly. Part of this is because these areas or these working class areas, sorry, of the cities grew so quickly. In some of these places, it is almost like overnight growth, and the infrastructure simply is not there, and they can't keep up with it. So even though it seems as though it's part of this, nefarious plot to kind of keep the working class, um, in a very degraded situation. Some of it is that, but the bigger part is the simple fact that you have all of these people from all over the place flooding into these specific areas of the city, and we don't have the infrastructure to kind of keep up with it. And that kind of explains the horrible living conditions. But not only are their living conditions horrible, but their working conditions are also horrible as well. Because these industrial factories are going to offer a very different kind of work environment than people will have been used to, where we have long hours, low wages, and child labor were typical for the poor, especially agricultural poor. But what's going to be new here is going to be the routine, the monotony of the work, the direct supervision, and the discipline. I mean, you are doing from sun up to sundown one task for 10 to 12 hours a day. And if you don't want to do it, they will find somebody else to do this job for you. If you're not doing the job fast enough, there's nothing that says that your manager won't come over and give you a whack. We also have industrial work being very insecure, especially at this point when the Industrial Revolution is so new. You may very well have a factory that is overproducing, can't sell the products that it produces, so it shuts down. Sometimes the factory will open back up, sometimes it won't. But all of those people that had been working in that factory now are out of work. And again, remember, there is no public safety net. It's not like there's unemployment insurance or anything to help you with rent or help you put food in your tummy. I mean, if you don't have a job, you don't have money. And if you don't have money, then you're pretty much up the creek. Now, even though we don't have any organized state dictated public services or public safety nets, we do have some remnants of an old way of life that had existed, especially within the guilds, where we have friendly societies, especially of artisans, for self help are going to be very common. And you will see as time goes on, you will see other organizations, other privately organized groups coming together to try to help out people that have fallen through the cracks. And even though we don't necessarily get any type of big social upheaval within England that forces, some type of political revolutionary change, it doesn't mean that we don't have protests of the people who are getting kicked in the teeth. So, for example, early on, we have skilled artisans that are sometimes wrecking machines and burning mills. These guys are going to have a very specific name. So you want to put down here next to number two, just put down the Luddites, and Luddites is Luddites. The Luddites believe, or the group of Luddites believe, that they can stop industrialization by destroying the machines. That if they destroy all the machines, then they'll have to go back to the old way of doing things. And this is particularly going to be done by some skilled artisans because they see their jobs being taken away from them by machines and by unskilled labor, because it doesn't take a lot of training in order to run these machines, certainly not the level that these artisans would have had, or the training that they would have had their whole lives. We also are going to have trade unions being legalized in 1824, with a growing number of factory workers joining them. These unions, just like modern day unions, are going to fight for better wages and working conditions. And at first, the upper class is going to fear them because they're going to see the unions as being radical. They're going to see the unions as wanting to change status quo. And the one thing that the upper class always likes and gets an advantage from is this status quo. We also, during the second half of this time period, are going to start to see some socialist ideas, spreading gradually. Like we'll have some utopian ideas by like Robert Owen, but the big socialist here that we'll deal with and we'll spend some time on later on is going to be Karl Marx, who lays out a full ideology of socialism. You want to put down here next to B, underneath number 5, that he believes history is a history of class struggle. He believes that history is a history of class struggle. So Marx is not talking about this, rosy all together for the team type of cooperativeness. Instead, he sees history as a series of struggles, specifically struggles between those that have, i.e., the aristocrats, or the very, very wealthy members of the bourgeoisie, of the middle class, of the upper middle class, and then the have nots, those that are being exploited by the wealthy, the ones who are making up the laborers within this industrial revolution. As time goes on, socialist ideas are going to be attractive to more radical trade unionists and some middle class intellectuals in the late 19th century. But in general, the British working class movement is going to remain moderate, and we have a reason for this. You want to put down here next to number 6, this is kind of a medium sized note. You want to put down in part because they work through many problems that still plagued continental Europe. One of the advantages that the English have is by going first, they're able to work through a lot of growing pains that the continent is still having to deal with. And the problem is that these growing pains that the continent is still able to that is still dealing with, socialism is going to be very appealing. Where in England, because we've had change, we've had modifications through laws and through guidelines created by the government, socialism isn't necessarily as appealing because the working class movement has realized that an effective way of getting change is by getting that change through government rather than through any type of social upheaval. Now, this doesn't mean that Marx isn't well read and isn't an inspiration within England. You will have a pocket of those, Marxian socialists ping-ponging around, but nowhere near the numbers in England that they will have on the continent. Capitalist and impoverished working classes didn't polarize because of the large middle and lower classes. One of the advantages is in England is that you have the possibility, or at least you perceive yourself to have the possibility to improve your position in society. That there is at least this appearance of more fluidity, more movement through the social classes. So if you're a member of the working class, you aspire to eventually become a member of the lower middle class. If you're a member of the lower middle class, you aspire to become a member of the middle class. There's always somebody that seems not necessarily out of reach for you socially, where continental Europe, that's not necessarily the case. And especially here by the end of the century, workers are having a better standard of living. I mean, you can't really complain about things too much if you have a roof over your head, money in your pocket, and food in your tummy. And this really is going to be one of the reasons why Marxism is not going to be as attractive in England, but also in general in Western Europe versus some other places like, say, for example, Russia. A note here that I want you to put down that sort of kind of like summarizes this in C. Do you want to put, please, here that wages improved, cheap food improved diets, Male workers gradually got the right to vote, and sanitary reform cleaned up cities. So all of those problems that we were talking about for the lower classes are going to slowly get better over the course of the century. Not necessarily the case in every place in continental Europe, and certainly not the case in places like, Russia. But in general, the workers in England are fairly well off. What also starts to happen here is that nationalism is going to bound workers to countries rather than workers around the world. By the end of the 1800s, by the end of the 19th centuries, we start to have a very clear definition of what it is, for example, to be English, what it is to be German, what it is to be French. And people's identity is wrapped up in that national identity rather than their professional identity. They're identifying, these workers are identifying themselves based upon their nation first, and then their workers, if even then. Sometimes, there'll be another definition in between them. So their position as worker is not as important as Marx, for example, would have wanted or thought. However, even though the situation is improving, we have immense inequalities remaining. I mean, the poor are still very poor, and the wealthy are just simply getting richer and richer and richer. By 1900, Britain was in economic decline relative to the newly industrialized states of the United States and Germany. You want to put down here next to 9 that they will replace industrial products with invisible exports like insurance and the buying and selling of currency. So what starts to happen here is that the size and the availability of natural resources of Germany and the United States are simply going to outperform Britain. So Britain is no longer going to be leading the world industrially. However, they will continue to lead economically because they find things to replace, or other economic opportunities to replace those industrial opportunities that now Germany and the United States are taking over. And this is going to be the selling of these invisible goods, like insurance, the buying and selling of currency, other kind of service-based industries rather than manufacturing type of industries. Kind of similar to ultimately what's going to go on with the United States. One of the other situations that is also defining this time period is going to be a massive migratory process that uprooted millions and setting them in motions both internally and around the world. Um, Half or more of the rural population in Europe is going to migrate to cities. Again, this is going to be the result of the Industrial Revolution because these early factories will start to pop up in cities, and there's economic opportunities within cities, especially as we need fewer and fewer farmers. These displaced farmers are going to look for those economic opportunities. So they're going to pick up and they're going to move to the city. We also have about 20% of Europeans between 1815 and 1939 who are going to leave Europe, the majority of whom are going to go to the United States. But you do have permanent emigration. You have people permanently leaving Europe. This is going to temporarily increase Europe's share of the world population. The greatest impact, of course, is going to be on the Americas, or emigration to Latin America is going to change the social makeup of many regions. Like I said earlier, we have the emigration to the United States is larger and more diverse than elsewhere. This is really going to be the time in which the United States is going to really become that bastion for immigrants. And this is definitely going to be part of the American myth, that melting pot that will come to define the United States. European immigration is also going to happen into the Russian Empire as well, where 10 million or more are going to emigrate from Siberia, from Russia, and the Ukraine. I mean, just simply going to areas of greater economic opportunity. That is going to be what defines most of this emigration. Not only who's going there, but the people who are economically desperate, but also the where they're going and why they're going. They're going to places that are economically booming, or at least there's the perception of economic stability and opportunity there. Um, and it also